The Foundling of Copper Ridge. Chapter 1. The Discovery. The morning mist still clung to the valley floor when Samuel Sam Donovan heard the sound that would change his life forever. It wasn't the usual creak of leather or snort of his mare, Sunset, as they rode the boundary of the Lazy S Ranch. It was something else entirely, a sound that made his weathered hands tighten on the reins and his heart skip a beat. At 52, Sam had been working cattle for more than half his life. He'd seen drought and flood, rustlers and wolves, birth and death in all their forms, but he'd never heard anything quite like the weak mewling cry that drifted across the morning air from somewhere near Willow Creek. Sam was a man carved from the hard rock of the Colorado Territory. His face bore the lines of too many seasons under the sun, and his gray eyes had seen more sorrow than most men could bear. 7 years ago, he'd lost everything that mattered. His wife, Sarah, and their twin boys to the fever that swept through Copper Ridge that terrible winter. He'd buried them on the hill behind their cabin and hadn't spoken more than necessary to another soul since. The other hands at the Lazy S gave him wide berth. They respected his skill with horse and rope, but they'd learned not to try drawing him into conversation around the bunkhouse fire. Sam preferred it that way. Work hard, keep to yourself, and try not to remember what it felt like when laughter filled your home. But that morning, as he guided Sunset through the willows that gave the creek its name, that philosophy was about to be tested. The sound came again. Definitely a cry, but so weak it could barely be heard over the babbling water. Sam dismounted and pushed through the thick brush, following the sound upstream. What he found made him curse under his breath and question his own eyes. Caught in the roots of an old cottonwood, bobbing slightly in the gentle current, was a wooden crate. The kind used to ship goods from back east, but smaller. And from inside that crate came the unmistakable sound of human distress. Sam waded into the knee-deep water without hesitation, his boots filling with the cold mountain runoff. The crate was heavier than he expected, and when he pried off the loosely nailed lid with his knife, his heart nearly stopped. Inside, wrapped in what had once been a clean blanket, but was now soaked and muddy, was a baby. A little boy, no more than a few months old, with dark hair plastered to his tiny head and lips blue from cold. The child's eyes were open, the deepest brown Sam had ever seen, and they looked up at him with an expression that seemed far too knowing for someone so young. "Jesus," Sam whispered, lifting the baby from the crate with hands that shook despite years of steady ranch work. What kind of devil puts a baby in a box and sets him afloat? The baby made another weak sound, and Sam could see the child was in bad shape. His skin was cold and pale, his breathing shallow. But when Sam held him close, the tiny boy seemed to calm slightly, one small fist gripping Sam's shirt with surprising strength. For a moment, Sam stood frozen in the creek, holding this dying child and remembering another time, another place, when he'd held his own boys like this. The memory was like a knife to the chest, but it also spurred him into action. "Come on, little one," he murmured, wrapping his own coat around the baby and climbing back onto Sunset. "Let's get you somewhere warm." Sam had never ridden so hard in his life. Sunset seemed to sense the urgency, stretching into a full gallop as they raced toward town. The baby grew weaker with each passing minute, his cries fading to barely audible whimpers. Sam pressed the child against his chest, trying to share his body heat as the landscape blurred past them. "Stay with me, boy," he said, his voice rough with emotions he'd kept buried for 7 years. "Don't you dare give up now." As they crested the hill overlooking Copper Ridge, Sam could see the town spread out below them like a collection of toy buildings. Smoke rose from chimneys, and people moved about their morning business, completely unaware that a miracle and a mystery were racing toward them at breakneck speed. The baby's eyes fluttered closed just as they reached the outskirts of town, and for a terrifying moment, Sam thought he was too late. But then he felt the slight rise and fall of the tiny chest against his own, and he knew there was still hope. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan's clinic sat at the end of Main Street, a modest wooden building with a hand-painted sign that had faded over the years. Sam had only been there once, when a bull had opened up his leg pretty good, and he'd found the doc to be competent and no nonsense. More importantly, she had a reputation for being good with children, something Copper Ridge desperately needed since old Doc Henderson had passed on the year before. What Sam didn't know was that doctor, Morgan, had her own ghosts. At 38, she was one of the few female physicians in the territory, having fought hard for her education back east before coming west to escape memories of her own. She'd lost her husband and infant daughter to cholera in St. Louis 5 years ago, and practicing medicine was her way of fighting back against the cruel randomness of death. When Sam burst through her door that morning, Doctor, Morgan was cleaning instruments and preparing for what she'd expected to be a quiet day. The sight of the desperate cowboy clutching a bundle to his chest immediately put her in professional mode. "Doctor, please," Sam gasped, unwrapping the baby. "I found him in the creek." "He's barely breathing." Dr. Morgan took one look at the blue-tinged infant, and her training kicked in completely. "Put him on the table. Now." What followed was the most intense hour of Sam's life. Dr. Morgan worked with the focused intensity of someone who'd battled death before and refused to accept defeat. She warmed the baby carefully, checked his airways, listened to his tiny heart, and administered drops of medicine with steady hands. Sam paced the small office like a caged wolf, jumping every time the baby made a sound. He'd forgotten what it felt like to care this much about whether someone lived or died, and the intensity of it nearly overwhelmed him. "Is he going to make it?" Sam finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Morgan looked up from her small patient, wiping sweat from her forehead. "He's stronger than he looks. Hypothermia, dehydration, but no signs of serious injury. Someone wrapped him carefully. They wanted him to be found." As if responding to her voice, the baby opened his eyes and made a soft sound that was almost like a coo. For the first time since finding him, Sam felt a flicker of hope. It was then that Martha Collins arrived. The 42-year-old seamstress had been walking past the clinic when she heard the commotion inside. Martha was known throughout Copper Ridge as a woman with a generous heart and gentle hands, qualities that had served her well in her work, but had never brought her the family she'd always wanted. Martha had been married once, briefly, to a man who'd been killed in a mining accident just months after their wedding. She'd never remarried, partly from choice and partly from the limited options in a frontier town. But her maternal instincts were strong, and she'd helped deliver and care for half the babies in Copper Ridge over the years. "Dr. Morgan," Martha called through the door. "Is everything all right? I heard—" She stopped mid-sentence when she saw the tiny baby on the examination table. "Martha, thank goodness, Doctor," Morgan said. "This child is going to need constant care for the next several days. Feeding every 2 hours, keeping him warm, watching for fever. I have other patients to see, and Mr. Donovan here looks like he hasn't slept in a week." Sam wanted to protest that he could handle it, but the truth was he was terrified of doing something wrong. His own boys had been toddlers when the fever took them. He'd never cared for an infant this young. Martha stepped closer to the table, and something magical happened. The baby, who had been fussy and restless, immediately calmed when she leaned over him. His tiny hand reached up, and when Martha offered her finger, he gripped it with surprising strength. "Oh my," Martha whispered, and Sam saw tears gathering in her eyes. "Look at those eyes. It's like he's trying to tell us something." Over the next few days, an unusual arrangement developed. Sam refused to leave the clinic, sleeping in a chair beside the baby's makeshift crib. Martha came by every few hours to help with feedings and changings, staying longer each time. Dr. Morgan checked on her patient regularly, amazed by his rapid recovery. It was Martha who first called him Daniel. "He needs a name," she said on the second day, as she fed him a bottle. "We can't keep calling him the baby." "Look at those wise eyes, like the Daniel in the Bible," Surviving the lion's den. Sam nodded, testing the name on his tongue. Daniel. I reckon it fits. The baby seemed to respond to his new name, turning his head when they called him, and even attempting what sounded like a laugh when Martha tickled his chin. But their peaceful arrangement was about to be shattered by news that would put little Daniel's life in danger once again. Chapter 2. The claim. Sheriff Jacob Hayes had been lawman in Copper Ridge for 15 years, and he'd learned to read trouble before it walked through his door. So when Clarence Blackwood's foreman, Pete Garrett, came calling with questions about any abandoned children that might have turned up, Sheriff Hayes knew he was dealing with something bigger than a simple lost child case. Clarence Blackwood owned the largest spread in 3 counties, the Triple B Ranch, and what Clarence wanted, he usually got. He had money, political connections, and the kind of influence that could make or break a man's prospects in the territory. When Blackwood sent his foreman to ask questions, smart men provided answers. But Sheriff Hayes had never been accused of being too smart for his own good. Can't say I've heard tell of any missing children, Sheriff Hayes told Garrett, technically telling the truth. Daniel wasn't missing. He'd been abandoned. Garrett shifted in his chair, his cold eyes scanning the sheriff's office. Mister. Blackwood's got reason to believe there might be a baby floating around town that belongs to his family. Says it's a delicate matter that needs handling with discretion. What kind of reason? Sheriff Hayes asked, though he was already beginning to suspect the answer. The kind that pays well for information and pays even better for silence, Garrett replied with a meaningful look. After Garrett left, Sheriff Hayes sat in his office for a long time, thinking. He'd heard the rumors about Sam Donovan and Martha Collins caring for a foundling at the clinic. He'd also heard whispers about Blackwood's daughter, Victoria, who'd been visiting relatives back east for the past several months. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots. The next morning, Sheriff Hayes paid a visit to Dr. Morgan's clinic. He found Sam teaching Daniel to grip his finger while Martha hummed a lullaby. The baby was clearly thriving, pink-cheeked and alert, with a smile that could melt stone. Sheriff, Sam said, standing up when Hayes entered. Something wrong? Sheriff Hayes looked at the baby, then at the 2 people who'd clearly fallen in love with the child. Might be. Clarence Blackwood's been asking questions about abandoned infants. Says one might belong to his family. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Martha instinctively moved closer to Daniel's crib, her protective instincts flaring. That baby was left to die in a creek, Sam said flatly. Whatever family he came from gave up their rights when they tried to kill him. I'm not disagreeing with you, Sheriff Hayes said carefully. But Blackwood's got legal standing if the child is his blood, and he's got the kind of lawyers who don't lose cases. Over the next few days, the truth began to emerge piece by piece. It was Clara Mendoza, the Blackwood family's cook, who finally couldn't keep the secret anymore. She found Martha at the general store and pulled her aside, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. That baby, Clara whispered, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. He belongs to Miss Victoria. She had him 6 months ago, but the family, they were so ashamed. An unmarried daughter with a child. It would ruin their reputation. Martha felt her world spinning. Victoria Blackwood was barely 20, the pampered daughter of the most powerful man in the territory. She'd supposedly been sent east for finishing school, but now the truth was becoming clear. What happened to the baby? Martha asked, though she was afraid she already knew. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Mr. Blackwood told Miss Victoria the baby died during birth. She grieved so hard, nearly went out of her mind with sorrow. But the baby lived. Mr. Blackwood, he paid someone to make the problem disappear. The full horror of the situation settled over Martha like a cold blanket. So they put him in that crate and set him loose in the creek. Clara nodded miserably. But now people are asking questions. Miss Victoria keeps asking about visiting the grave, wanting to put flowers on it. Mr. Blackwood is worried someone will figure out there is no grave. That evening, Martha shared Clara's revelation with Sam and Dr. Morgan. They sat in the clinic after hours, watching Daniel sleep peacefully in his crib, and tried to figure out what to do with information that could destroy the most powerful family in the territory. "They're not getting him back," Sam said with quiet intensity. "I don't care how much money or influence they have. You don't try to kill a child and then claim him back when it's convenient." Dr. Morgan nodded her agreement. "That baby has thrived under your care. Medically speaking, removing him from his current situation would be traumatic and potentially harmful. But even as they made their vows to protect Daniel, they all knew the challenge ahead. When Clarence Blackwood wanted something, he usually got it. The question was, how far would he go to claim a grandchild he'd once tried to eliminate? The answer came the next morning when Victoria Blackwood herself arrived at the clinic. She was nothing like what Martha had expected. Instead of the pampered princess she'd imagined, Victoria was a young woman who looked like she'd aged years and months. She was thin, pale, with haunted eyes and hands that shook as she approached the building. "Please," Victoria said when Martha opened the door, "I know my son is here. I just want to see him." Martha's heart broke a little at the desperation in the young woman's voice, but when she looked back at Daniel, playing contentedly in his crib, she felt her resolve strengthen. "What makes you think there's a baby here?" Martha asked carefully. Victoria's composure cracked. "Because I've been living a lie for 6 months. My father told me my baby died and I believed him. But yesterday I overheard the servants talking. My son is alive, and he's here." Behind Victoria, 2 men on horseback waited. Blackwood's hired guns, making sure his daughter didn't say too much or stay too long. "May I see him?" "Please," Victoria asked, tears streaming down her face. "I promise I won't try to take him. I just need to know he's real." Martha hesitated, then stepped aside. Victoria entered the clinic like she was walking into a church, reverent and afraid. When she saw Daniel, now 6 months old and clearly thriving, Victoria gasped. The baby looked up at the stranger and smiled, that same bright smile that had been winning hearts all over Copper Ridge. "Hello, sweet boy," Victoria whispered, approaching his crib slowly. "You look just like your daddy." At the mention of the baby's father, Martha realized there was even more to this story. But when Victoria tried to pick Daniel up, the baby began to cry. Not the desperate wails they'd heard when he was sick, but the confused, frightened crying of a child who didn't recognize the person holding him. Daniel reached frantically toward Martha, his small voice calling, "Mama! Mama!" in the clear tones he'd recently mastered. Victoria's face crumpled as her own son rejected her touch. "He doesn't know me," she whispered, the words breaking her heart. "My own baby doesn't know me." She looked at Martha with a mixture of gratitude and anguish. "You saved him. You gave him the love I couldn't." Her voice grew stronger, more determined. "My father thinks he can just reclaim Daniel like he's a lost piece of property, but I won't let him. This baby deserves better than the Blackwood name and all the poison that comes with it." Outside, one of the hired men was getting restless, and Victoria knew her time was up. She kissed her son's forehead gently, then looked Martha in the eyes. "I have information that could help you keep him safe from my father. Meet me tomorrow night at the old mill. Come alone and bring Mr. Donovan if you trust him. There are things about the Blackwood family that could change everything." As Victoria left, Daniel stopped crying and reached for Martha, babbling contentedly as she picked him up. But Martha knew their peaceful days were numbered. Clarence Blackwood was about to make his move, and when he did, it would be with all the power and ruthlessness that had built his empire. The battle for Daniel's future was just beginning. Chapter 3. Revelations. The old mill had been abandoned for 5 years, ever since the new grain operation opened closer to the railroad. It sat beside Copper Creek like a weathered monument to better times, its wheel frozen and its windows dark. But on this moonlit night, it served as the perfect meeting place for secrets that could topple empires. Sam arrived first, his hand resting on the Colt at his hip as he surveyed the shadows. He'd left Daniel sleeping peacefully at Martha's house, with Dr. Morgan standing guard. Every instinct told him this was dangerous, but Victoria Blackwood had sounded desperate enough to risk everything. Martha appeared a few minutes later, moving quietly through the darkness. She'd been unable to sleep, holding Daniel and imagining all the ways Clarence Blackwood might try to take him away. The baby had sensed her distress, staying unusually clingy and fussy throughout the evening. "Are you sure about this?" Sam asked as they approached the mill together. Before Martha could answer, Victoria stepped out of the shadows. But she wasn't alone. Beside her stood a man Sam recognized as Johnny Reeves, one of the younger hands from the Triple B. What Sam didn't know was that Johnny was also the father of Victoria's child. "Thank you for coming," Victoria said, her voice steadier than it had been at the clinic. "There are things you need to know about my family, things that will help you protect Daniel." She gestured toward Johnny. "This is Johnny Reeves. He's Daniel's father." The revelation hit Sam like a physical blow. Johnny was a good kid, hardworking, honest, the kind of young man who'd make a fine husband and father under different circumstances. But he was also a ranch hand with no money, no family connections, and no chance of being considered suitable for a Blackwood daughter. "We wanted to get married," Victoria continued, her hand finding Johnny's. "We were planning to elope when I found out I was carrying Daniel. But my father discovered our plans before we could leave." Johnny spoke up, his young face hard with anger. "Mr. Blackwood had me beaten and threatened to have me killed if I ever came near Victoria again. Then he sent her away and told everyone she was going to school back east. But she never left Colorado," Victoria added. "My father kept me prisoner at a cabin up in the mountains. When Daniel was born, I was told he died. They drugged me, and when I woke up, there was no baby." Her voice broke slightly. "I grieved for months, wanting to die myself." Sam felt sick to his stomach. "So your father had someone put Daniel in that crate and send him down the creek?" Victoria nodded. "A man named Jake Morrison. My father paid him to make the baby disappear permanently. But Morrison got drunk and talked too much. Word got back to my father that people were asking questions about a baby found in the creek. That's why Blackwood's suddenly interested in claiming Daniel," Martha realized. "He's afraid Morrison will talk." "Exactly," Victoria said. "My father's whole reputation is built on being the moral authority in this territory. If people found out he tried to murder his own grandchild, it would destroy him politically and financially." Johnny stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. "Victoria and I want to testify against her father, but we need Daniel to be safe first. Blackwood has judges in his pocket, but he doesn't control everyone." Victoria reached into her coat and pulled out a bundle of papers. "These are letters between my father and Morrison, discussing payment for disposal services. I also have documents showing where Morrison banked the money, all traceable back to my father's accounts." She handed the papers to Martha. "Hide these somewhere safe. If anything happens to Johnny or me, make sure they get to the territorial marshal. Judge Morrison might be bought, but Marshal Thompson is honest." Sam examined the documents by moonlight, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The letters were detailed, cold-blooded discussions of murder, written in Clarence Blackwood's own hand. "Why are you doing this?" Sam asked Victoria. "He's your father." Victoria's eyes flashed with a steel Sam hadn't seen before. "He stopped being my father the day he tried to kill my son. Daniel deserves a real family, people who love him. You and Martha have given him that." As they prepared to leave, Johnny caught Sam's arm. "There's something else you need to know. Morrison's getting scared. Word is he's planning to leave the territory. If he runs before we can get him to testify, Blackwood will be in the clear." The next few days passed in tense preparation. Martha hid Victoria's evidence in 3 separate locations around town, while Sam made discreet inquiries about Jake Morrison's whereabouts. Dr. Morgan began documenting Daniel's medical condition and progress, creating a record that would support their claim that removing him from his current home would be harmful. But Clarence Blackwood wasn't sitting idle. On Thursday morning, he arrived in Copper Ridge with a team of lawyers from Denver and a court order demanding custody of his grandson, David Blackwood. The fact that he'd gotten the baby's name wrong told Sam everything he needed to know about Blackwood's true feelings for Daniel. Judge Morrison, clearly uncomfortable but legally bound by the court order, scheduled a hearing for the following Monday. "This is a complex case involving family rights," he announced. "I'll hear testimony from all parties before making a decision." That weekend, the entire town seemed to hold its breath. Daniel, oblivious to the legal storm swirling around him, continued to delight everyone with his growing vocabulary and infectious smile. He'd started pulling himself up to standing, and his favorite game was dropping his wooden horse and waiting for someone to pick it up. Martha barely slept, terrified that Monday would bring the end of the happiest months of her life. Sam spent hours staring at Daniel, remembering his own boys and promising himself he wouldn't lose another child to circumstances beyond his control. On Sunday evening, as Martha was putting Daniel to bed, he looked up at her with those serious brown eyes and said, clear as a bell, "Mama loved Daniel." It was the first time he'd put together a complete sentence, and Martha burst into tears of joy and terror. Tomorrow, she might lose the right to hear those precious words ever again. But unknown to any of them, Jake Morrison had made a decision that would change everything. Drunk, guilty, and terrified of Clarence Blackwood's reach, he'd decided to confess everything to Sheriff Hayes. As Monday morning dawned over Copper Ridge, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just Daniel's future, but the fate of the most powerful family in the territory. Chapter 4. The Hearing. The courthouse had never seen such a crowd. It seemed like every person in Copper Ridge had found an excuse to attend the custody hearing that would determine little Daniel's fate. The pews were packed with ranchers, shopkeepers, miners, and families, all drawn by the drama of seeing Clarence Blackwood's empire challenged. Judge Morrison looked distinctly uncomfortable as he surveyed the packed courtroom. He was a decent man, but he owed his position to political appointees who owed their positions to men like Clarence Blackwood. The weight of that obligation sat heavy on his shoulders as he called the court to order. Clarence Blackwood sat at the front table with his legal team, 3 sharp-suited lawyers from Denver who looked like they could argue Satan out of hellfire. Blackwood himself was every inch the territorial patriarch, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, radiating the kind of confidence that came from never losing a fight that mattered. Across the aisle sat Sam and Martha with John Webster, Copper Ridge's only other lawyer. Webster was a good man who usually handled property disputes and simple contracts. Going up against Blackwood's legal team was like bringing a slingshot to a gunfight. Between the opposing sides, in Martha's arms, sat Daniel. At 8 months old, he was a picture of perfect health and happiness, babbling contentedly and reaching for Martha's hair with chubby fingers. Several people in the courtroom smiled at his antics, but Blackwood's cold stare never wavered. The lead Denver lawyer, Harrison Price, stood to make his opening statement. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter of family rights. My client, Mr. Clarence Blackwood, seeks custody of his grandson, who rightfully belongs with his blood relatives. The child's mother, Miss Victoria Blackwood, is prepared to provide him with every advantage their prominent family can offer." Judge Morrison nodded and made notes. "And what is the family's explanation for how the child came to be found abandoned in Copper Creek?" Price's confident expression flickered slightly. "There was a tragic misunderstanding, Your Honor. Due to complications during birth and poor communication, the family was led to believe the child had died. When they learned of their error, they immediately sought to reclaim him." John Webster stood for his opening. He might not have had the polish of the Denver lawyers, but he had the truth on his side. "Your Honor, this misunderstanding nearly cost an innocent baby his life. My clients found this child dying in a creek, abandoned like garbage. They saved him, nursed him back to health, and have provided him with love and stability for months. The child clearly recognizes them as his parents." As if to emphasize the point, Daniel looked up at Martha and said clearly, "Mama!" Then he turned to Sam and clapped his hands, babbling happily. Several people in the courtroom murmured appreciatively at the sweet interaction. But Blackwood's expression remained stone cold. Price called his first witness. "I'd like to call Victoria Blackwood to the stand." But when the bailiff looked around the courtroom, Victoria was nowhere to be found. Price conferred quickly with Blackwood, his confidence clearly shaken. "Your Honor, Miss Blackwood appears to have been delayed. I'd like to call my next witness instead." "I'll call Dr. Edmund Hartwell, our family physician from Denver." Dr. Hartwell was an elderly man with impressive credentials who testified that the child would receive the finest medical care available in the Blackwood household. But under cross-examination by Webster, he admitted he'd never actually examined Daniel and was basing his testimony solely on what the Blackwood family had told him. Next, Price called character witnesses who testified to the Blackwood family's sterling reputation and financial stability. But their testimony felt hollow when contrasted with the obvious love between Daniel and his current caregivers. When it came time for Webster's witnesses, the tide began to turn. Dr. Morgan took the stand first, her professional manner commanding respect. She testified about Daniel's condition when he was brought to her clinic and his remarkable recovery under Sam and Martha's care. "This child was suffering from severe hypothermia and dehydration," she explained. "Without immediate, careful nursing, he would have died. Mr. Donovan and Miss Collins provided exactly the kind of round-the-clock care he needed." Under Price's cross-examination, Doctor. Morgan remained unshakable. "The child has formed strong, healthy attachments to his current caregivers. Removing him at this stage could cause significant psychological trauma." Martha's testimony was deeply moving as she described caring for Daniel, watching him recover, and seeing him grow into the happy, thriving child he'd become. When she spoke about losing her own husband and finding purpose again in caring for Daniel, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. "He's not just surviving with us," Martha said softly. "He's blooming. He's learned to trust that when he needs something, we'll be there. That's worth more than all the money in the world." Sam's testimony was equally powerful. The tough cowboy's voice broke as he spoke about finding Daniel in the creek and fearing he was too late. "I lost my own children 7 years ago," he said, looking directly at Judge Morrison. "I thought that part of my heart was dead forever. But Daniel brought it back to life. He calls me Papa now, and every time he does, it fills a hole I thought would never heal." Price tried to shake Sam's testimony, suggesting he was an unsuitable guardian due to his rough lifestyle and limited means. But Sam's quiet dignity and obvious love for Daniel made the lawyer's attacks seem petty and cruel. Then Webster dropped his bombshell. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Jake Morrison to the stand." The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs. Morrison shuffled to the witness stand, clearly nervous and possibly still drunk from the night before. His appearance was a stark contrast to the polished witnesses Blackwood's team had presented. Under Webster's gentle questioning, Morrison told the whole sordid story. How Blackwood had approached him about disposing of a problem. How he'd been paid to put the baby in a crate and set it loose in the creek. How guilt had been eating at him ever since. "I heard that baby crying in the box," Morrison said, his voice shaking. "I knew it was wrong, but Mr. Blackwood paid me good money and said it was for the best of everyone. I've been haunted by that sound ever since." Blackwood's lawyers tried to discredit Morrison as a drunk and unreliable witness, but the man's obvious remorse and detailed knowledge of the arrangement were convincing. Just when it seemed Webster had played his strongest card, the courtroom doors burst open. Sheriff Hayes entered, followed by Victoria Blackwood and Johnny Reeves. But they weren't alone. Behind them walked a tall man with a badge that made everyone sit up and take notice. U.S. Marshal Thompson. "Your Honor," Sheriff Hayes announced, "I have a warrant for the arrest of Clarence Blackwood on charges of conspiracy to commit murder and child endangerment." The courtroom exploded in chaos. Blackwood shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. "This is outrageous. You can't arrest me based on the word of that drunk." But Marshal Thompson stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "Mr. Blackwood, we have documentary evidence of your involvement in the attempted murder of your grandchild, letters in your own handwriting, financial records, and witness testimony." Victoria stood up in the gallery, her voice clear and strong. "I've given Marshal Thompson all the evidence he needs to prosecute my father, and I want to testify on behalf of Mr. Donovan and Miss Collins." As Blackwood was led away in handcuffs, still protesting his innocence, Victoria approached the witness stand. Her testimony was devastating to her father's case, and heartbreaking in its honesty. She spoke about being kept prisoner during her pregnancy, about being told her baby had died, about months of grief and despair. She told the court about her love affair with Johnny Reeves and their plans to marry. "Daniel was conceived in love," she said, looking at her son in Martha's arms. "Johnny and I wanted to be a family, but my father's pride was more important to him than our happiness or our child's life." When she finished, Victoria made an unprecedented request. "Your Honor, I formally renounce any parental claim to Daniel. I want Mr. Donovan and Miss Collins to adopt him legally. They've been his real parents from the moment they saved his life. I'm asking only to be allowed to visit him occasionally, so he can know his story when he's older." Johnny Reeves stepped forward and made the same renunciation. "I want what's best for my son, and that's growing up with people who love him more than anything in the world." Judge Morrison called for a recess, and when court reconvened an hour later, his decision was swift and decisive. This court finds that Daniel Donovan, and yes, I'm using the name his loving caregivers gave him, belongs with Samuel Donovan and Martha Collins. They have provided him with love, stability, and security when his blood relatives failed to do so. The judge's voice grew stronger. Furthermore, this court is prepared to approve adoption proceedings that will make this arrangement permanent and legal. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Daniel, startled by the noise, looked around with wide eyes before reaching for Martha and babbling something that sounded remarkably like home. 6 months later, the adoption was finalized in a simple ceremony attended by half the town. Daniel, now walking confidently and chattering nonstop, served as the star of his own adoption party. That same day, Sam and Martha were married in the church on Main Street, with Daniel serving as their ring bearer, or at least trying to, before he got distracted by a butterfly and wandered off to chase it down the aisle. As for Clarence Blackwood, he was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in territorial prison. His empire crumbled without his iron control, and the Triple B Ranch was sold to pay his legal debts. Victoria and Johnny married quietly and started their own small ranch with money Victoria had inherited from her grandmother. They visited Daniel regularly, not as his parents, but as beloved family friends who always brought presents and stories of his heritage. On Daniel's 2nd birthday, as the whole town gathered to celebrate, Martha watched her son blow out his candles with all the determined concentration of a child making a very important wish. "What did you wish for, sweetheart?" she asked. Daniel looked around at all the faces smiling back at him. Sam and Martha, Doctor. Morgan, Sheriff Hayes, Victoria and Johnny, and dozens of friends who had watched him grow from a dying infant into a thriving toddler. "No wish," he said in his clear, confident voice. "Got everything. Got Mama, got Papa, got everybody." His simple words brought tears to every adult eye in the room. Here was a child who had been thrown away like garbage, left to die in a cold creek, but who had found something more valuable than all of Clarence Blackwood's money and power combined. He had found love. Chapter 5. Growing Strong. 5 years passed like pages turning in a well-loved book. Daniel grew from a wobbly toddler into a confident 7-year-old who could ride a horse almost as well as his Papa Sam and help Mama Martha in her garden with the serious dedication of a born rancher. The boy had inherited the best traits from all the people who loved him. He had Johnny's easy smile and natural way with animals, Victoria's intelligence and curiosity about the world, Sam's quiet strength and integrity, and Martha's gentle heart and fierce protectiveness of those he cared about. By age 7, Daniel knew his story. Martha and Sam had told it to him gradually, age-appropriately, making sure he understood that he was chosen and wanted, not abandoned. They told him about the brave young woman who gave birth to him, the scared young man who was his first father, and the evil grandfather who tried to hurt him but failed, because love was stronger than hate. "Tell me the story again, Mama," Daniel would ask on quiet evenings, and Martha would begin the familiar tale. "Once upon a time, there was a cowboy named Papa Sam who found a tiny baby floating in a creek." Daniel would listen with rapt attention, even though he knew every word by heart. The story wasn't just history to him. It was proof that miracles could happen, that people could find each other when they needed each other most, and that families weren't always made by blood, but always by choice. The boy thrived in the growing town of Copper Ridge. The railroad had finally arrived, bringing new people and opportunities. Sam had used his savings to buy a small spread of his own, and with Martha's practical wisdom and Daniel's eager help, they built a modest but prosperous ranch. Daniel attended the schoolhouse where Martha taught, though she had to work hard not to show favoritism to her own son. The boy was bright and curious, always asking questions that made the adults around him think deeper than they'd expected to think. He was also becoming something of a local celebrity. Visitors to Copper Ridge often heard the story of the baby in the creek and wanted to meet the miracle child who had survived against impossible odds. Daniel handled the attention with the same quiet dignity Sam had taught him, polite but never boastful about his unusual beginning. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Daniel was his capacity for forgiveness and understanding. When he was old enough to truly comprehend what Clarence Blackwood had tried to do to him, his response surprised everyone. "He was scared," Daniel said simply when Martha tried to explain why some people do terrible things. "When people get really scared, sometimes they make bad choices. I feel sorry for him." This wisdom from a 7-year-old left Martha speechless and convinced her more than ever that Daniel was destined for something special. Victoria and Johnny visited every few months, and their relationship with Daniel had evolved into something beautiful and complex. To Daniel, they were Uncle Johnny and Aunt Victoria, special friends who shared his brown eyes and always brought interesting presents from their travels. Victoria had become a teacher herself, opening a school for children whose families couldn't afford formal education. Johnny had proven himself an excellent rancher, and their small operation was growing steadily. They had married for love and built a life together based on the second chance Daniel's survival had given them. Dr. Morgan remained a constant presence in Daniel's life, monitoring his health, but more importantly serving as another loving adult in his extended family. She often marveled at how the sick, dying infant she'd treated had grown into such a vibrant, healthy child. Sheriff Hayes, now getting on in years, had trained Daniel in basic marksmanship and horsemanship, declaring the boy a natural at both. "That young one's got the makings of a fine lawman," he'd tell anyone who'd listen. "Sharp eyes, steady hands, and a sense of justice that runs bone deep." But it was the relationship between Daniel and his adopted parents that truly defined the boy's character. With Sam, Daniel learned the values of hard work, integrity, and quiet strength. Sam taught him to read the sky for weather, to gentle a spooked horse with patience instead of force, and to measure a man by his actions rather than his words. "A man's word is his bond," Sam would tell him, as they worked together mending fence or breaking horses. "Once you give it, it becomes part of who you are. Don't give it lightly, but once you do, honor it completely." With Martha, Daniel learned compassion, intellectual curiosity, and the power of forgiveness. Martha taught him to read before most children knew their letters, to solve problems with his mind before resorting to physical solutions, and to see the good in people even when they'd done wrong. "Everyone has a story, Daniel," Martha would tell him when they encountered difficult people in town. "Most of the time, when someone's mean or cruel, it's because they're hurting inside. That doesn't excuse their behavior, but understanding it can help you respond with wisdom instead of anger. The combination of these influences created a remarkable young man. Daniel was tough when he needed to be, but gentle by nature. He could rope a calf or solve a complex arithmetic problem with equal skill. He treated the town drunk with the same respect he showed the territorial judge, because both were human beings deserving of dignity. Most importantly, Daniel understood love, both how to give it and how to receive it. Chapter 6. The Test. Daniel's 8th birthday brought an unexpected challenge that would test everything Sam and Martha had taught him about family, loyalty, and doing what was right. It started with a letter delivered by the territorial mail carrier on a crisp October morning. The envelope was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Donovan in elegant handwriting that Martha didn't recognize. Inside was a message that made both Sam and Martha's blood run cold. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Donovan, my name is Margaret Blackwood, and I am Clarence Blackwood's sister. I have recently learned of my nephew's existence and whereabouts. I am writing to inform you that I intend to petition the territorial court for custody of the child, as I am his nearest surviving blood relative of good standing. I have substantial means and can provide the boy with advantages you cannot match. I believe this arrangement would be in everyone's best interests. I will arrive in Copper Ridge next month to meet the child and assess his situation. Respectfully, Mrs. Margaret Blackwood Sterling. Martha sank into a chair, the letter trembling in her hands. She wants to take Daniel. Sam read the letter again, his jaw tightening with each word. Clarence Blackwood's sister. I thought his whole family had washed their hands of the scandal. Apparently not all of them, Martha whispered, watching Daniel through the window as he played with his wooden horse in the yard, completely unaware that his world might be about to change again. That evening, after Daniel had gone to bed, Sam and Martha sat at their kitchen table trying to figure out what to do. The adoption was legal and final, but they knew that in territorial courts, blood relatives with money and influence could sometimes overturn previous decisions, especially if they could prove the child would be better off with them. We need to contact John Webster, Sam said finally. Find out what our legal standing is. Martha nodded, but her heart was heavy with worry. They'd been so happy, so secure in their little family. The thought of losing Daniel now was almost unbearable. Webster's assessment wasn't encouraging. The adoption is solid, he told them the next day. But Margaret Blackwood Sterling isn't just any relative. She's married to Edmund Sterling, who owns half the silver mines in Colorado. They have political connections all the way to Washington. He paused, looking uncomfortable. There's more. I did some research on Mrs. Sterling. She and her husband tried for years to have children, but couldn't. She's reportedly been devastated by their childlessness. Taking in her orphaned nephew could be seen as a noble act by the courts. Sam felt sick. So what you're saying is she might actually have a case. I'm saying we need to be prepared for a fight, Webster replied, and this time our opponents will have resources that make Clarence Blackwood look poor. The news got worse when Sheriff Hayes stopped by that evening. I've been asking around about Mrs. Sterling, he said, accepting Martha's offer of coffee. She's got a reputation as a strong-willed woman who usually gets what she wants. Word is she's already hired investigators to look into Daniel's situation here. What kind of investigators? Sam asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. The kind that look for reasons why a child might be better off somewhere else, Sheriff Hayes said grimly. They'll be examining everything, your finances, your backgrounds, Daniel's education and opportunities, looking for any weakness they can exploit. That night, Martha barely slept. She lay in bed listening to Sam's troubled breathing and thinking about all the ways their lives might not measure up to the Sterling family's wealth and status. They weren't poor, but they weren't rich either. Daniel had a good education, but not the kind of private tutoring wealth could buy. He was healthy and happy. But what if that wasn't enough in the eyes of the law? The investigators arrived 2 weeks later, a husband and wife team from Denver who introduced themselves as educational consultants, but asked questions that had nothing to do with schooling. They examined the Donovan household with calculating eyes. taking notes about everything from the condition of Daniel's clothes to the number of books in their small library. They interviewed neighbors, asking pointed questions about Sam and Martha's parenting and Daniel's behavior. Daniel, with the sharp instincts he'd inherited from all his parents, sensed something was wrong. "Mama?" he asked one evening after the investigators had spent an hour questioning him about his daily routine. "Are those people trying to take me away?" Martha's heart broke at the fear in his young voice. She knelt down to his eye level, taking his hands in hers. "Some people think you might be happier living somewhere else," she said carefully. "But Papa Sam and I love you more than anything in this world, and we're going to fight to keep our family together." Daniel's brown eyes, so much like Johnny's, filled with determination. "I don't want to live anywhere else. This is my home. You're my real mama and papa. And you're our real son," Martha assured him, pulling him into a fierce hug. "Nothing will ever change that." But even as she spoke the words, Martha wondered if love alone would be enough to win against the kind of power and money the Sterling family possessed. Margaret Blackwood Sterling arrived in Copper Ridge on the first Saturday in November, traveling in a private railroad car that caused quite a stir at the depot. She was a handsome woman in her mid-40s, impeccably dressed and radiating the kind of confidence that came from never being denied anything she truly wanted. Her first stop was the courthouse, where she met with Judge Morrison, the same judge who had presided over Clarence's trial and Daniel's adoption. Her second stop was the Grand Hotel, Copper Ridge's finest accommodation, where she held court like visiting royalty. Her third stop was the Donovan Ranch. Sam and Martha had prepared for this visit as carefully as generals preparing for battle. The house was spotless. Daniel was dressed in his best clothes, and they'd coached him gently about being polite but honest. When Mrs. Sterling's carriage pulled up to their modest home, Daniel was playing in the yard with his wooden horse, the same toy Sam had carved for him years ago. He looked up as the elegant lady approached, his expression curious but wary. "You must be Daniel," Mrs. Sterling said, her voice cultured and precise. "I am your great-aunt Margaret. Your grandfather Clarence was my brother." Daniel stood up slowly, automatically removing his hat as Sam had taught him when meeting a lady. "Ma'am," he said politely, "Mama and Papa told me you wanted to meet me." Mrs. Sterling's eyes took in everything: Daniel's clean but simple clothes, his confident posture, the obvious affection in his voice when he mentioned his parents. She knelt gracefully to his eye level, despite her expensive dress. "I've come a very long way to see you, Daniel. I've heard so much about the brave little boy who survived such a terrible ordeal." Daniel nodded seriously. "Papa Sam saved me from the creek. Then Mama Martha helped me get better. They're the best parents in the whole world." Something flickered in Mrs. Sterling's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, at the boy's directness and confidence. She'd expected to find a rough, poorly educated child who would be obviously better off in more refined circumstances. Instead, she found a well-spoken, intelligent, clearly loved boy who showed no signs of wanting or needing rescue. Martha appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mrs. Sterling, would you like to come inside? I've made fresh coffee." Over the next hour, Mrs. Sterling observed the Donovan family with the calculating eye of someone assessing a business proposition. She watched Sam help Daniel with his arithmetic homework, his patience infinite as he explained long division for the third time. She watched Martha read to Daniel from a book of poetry, the boy's rapt attention showing his love of learning. She watched Daniel himself, polite, articulate, clearly secure in his parents' love. "You've done well with him," Mrs. Sterling finally said, and there was genuine surprise in her voice. "He's quite remarkable for a child of his circumstances." Sam's jaw tightened at the implied insult, but Martha placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Daniel is remarkable," Martha agreed simply, "but not because of anything we did. He was born with a strong spirit and a loving heart. We just try to nurture what was already there." Mrs. Sterling stood to leave, but at the door, she turned back to Daniel. What do you want to be when you grow up, young man? Daniel thought seriously about the question. I want to help people, he said finally, like Papa Sam helped me, and like Dr. Morgan helps sick folks. Maybe I'll be a doctor, or maybe a lawman like Sheriff Hayes. I haven't decided yet. And what if I told you I could give you opportunities to become anything you wanted? The finest schools, travel to see the world, advantages these good people can't provide? Daniel looked confused by the question. But I already have everything I need. I have Mama and Papa who love me, friends who care about me, and teachers who help me learn. What else would I want? Mrs. Sterling stared at the boy for a long moment, then nodded curtly and left without another word. That evening, as Martha tucked Daniel into bed, he asked the question that had been troubling him all day. Mama, is that lady going to make me go live with her? Martha sat on the edge of his bed, smoothing his dark hair. She might try, sweetheart. But remember what we've always told you. You belong with people who love you completely, just as you are. And nobody loves you more completely than Papa Sam and I do. Daniel was quiet for a moment, then looked up at her with eyes far too serious for an 8-year-old. If she does take me away, will you forget about me? Martha's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. Daniel Donovan, I could no more forget about you than I could forget how to breathe. You are carved into my heart forever, no matter where you are. Good, Daniel said, snuggling into his pillow, because I could never forget you either. You're my real mama, forever and always. As Martha turned down the lamp and left Daniel's room, she made a silent vow. Whatever it took, whatever she had to sacrifice, she would not let anyone take her son away from the family that had chosen him and been chosen by him in return. But the battle for Daniel's future was just beginning, and Margaret Sterling had resources and determination that would test every bit of love and courage the Donovan family possessed. Chapter 7. The Final Stand. The custody hearing was scheduled for the first Monday in December, giving both sides 6 weeks to prepare their cases. The news spread through Copper Ridge like wildfire, dividing the town between those who supported the Donovans and those who believed Daniel would be better off with his wealthy relatives. Mrs. Sterling established herself at the Grand Hotel and began what could only be described as a campaign. She made generous donations to the church, the school, and various civic organizations. She hired local workers at premium wages to make improvements to the hotel. She was charming, gracious, and subtly reminded everyone of the advantages she could provide for Daniel. But she also made a critical error in judgment. Mrs. Sterling arranged to have Daniel brought to the hotel for tea, intending to impress him with luxury and refinement. What she didn't understand was that Daniel, despite his young age, had inherited a deep sense of loyalty from all his parents, birth and adoptive. The tea was an elaborate affair in the hotel's private dining room. Fine china, silver service, delicate pastries that probably cost more than Sam made in a week. Mrs. Sterling was gracious and attentive, asking Daniel about his interests and dreams. But when she began speaking negatively about his current situation, suggesting that he was making do with less than he deserved, that his parents were good people but limited in what they could offer him, Daniel's polite mask slipped. "Ma'am," he said, setting down his teacup with the careful precision Sam had taught him, "I don't think you understand. Mama Martha and Papa Sam didn't just give me a home. They gave me life. They chose me when nobody else wanted me. They're not my second-best choice. They're my first choice, my only choice, and my forever choice." Mrs. Sterling was taken aback by the 8-year-old's directness. "Daniel, dear, you're too young to understand what you might be missing. I could give you—" "Nothing I want," Daniel interrupted, then caught himself and added politely, "Ma'am, you seem like a nice lady, but you're not my family. My family is the people who love me exactly as I am, not the people who want to change me into something else." The tea ended awkwardly, and Mrs. Sterling's confidence was shaken for the first time since arriving in Copper Ridge. Meanwhile, the Donovan camp was preparing for legal battle with everything they had. John Webster had reached out to colleagues across the territory, gathering precedents and building their defense. Dr. Morgan was documenting Daniel's physical and emotional health under his current care. Sheriff Hayes was quietly investigating Mrs. Sterling's background, looking for anything that might weaken her case. But their strongest weapon was Daniel himself. Victoria and Johnny arrived from their ranch 2 weeks before the hearing, and their presence added another layer of complexity to the case. As Daniel's birth parents, their support for the Donovans carried significant legal weight. "We made our choice years ago," Victoria told anyone who asked. "Sam and Martha are Daniel's parents in every way that matters. We support them completely." The town rallied around the Donovan family in ways that surprised even their closest friends. The shopkeepers where Martha bought supplies offered to testify about her character. The ranchers who worked with Sam spoke up about his integrity and skill as a father. Daniel's schoolmates and their parents organized letter-writing campaigns to Judge Morrison. Most importantly, Dr. Morgan made a discovery that would prove crucial to their case. While reviewing Daniel's medical records from his infancy, she noticed something she'd forgotten in the drama of saving his life. The baby had been born with a small but distinctive birthmark on his left shoulder. A mark that was clearly visible in her early medical notes, but had faded as he grew. More significantly, she found records indicating that the baby had been slightly premature and underweight at birth, requiring special care that Mrs. Sterling, for all her wealth, was not trained to provide. "Your Honor," Dr. Morgan would later testify, "removing this child from the specialized care environment where he's thrived would be medically inadvisable." The bond between Daniel and his caregivers isn't just emotional, it's therapeutic. As the hearing date approached, Mrs. Sterling made one final attempt to sway public opinion. She arranged for a reporter from the Denver newspaper to interview her about her charitable mission to rescue her orphaned great-nephew. The article, when it appeared, painted the Donovans as well-meaning but limited people who were selfishly keeping Daniel from opportunities he deserved. It suggested that true love sometimes meant letting go, allowing a child to reach his full potential with people better equipped to provide for him. The article backfired spectacularly. The people of Copper Ridge had watched Daniel grow from a dying infant into a thriving, confident, loving child. They'd seen the devotion Sam and Martha poured into their son, and they'd witnessed Daniel's obvious happiness and security. Letters poured into the newspaper from all over the territory, defending the Donovan family and criticizing Mrs. Sterling's implied assertion that money was more important than love in raising a child. The most powerful response came from an unexpected source. Rebecca Thornton, now Rebecca Michaels, having remarried a kind shopkeeper from a neighboring town, wrote a letter that was reprinted in newspapers across Colorado. "I gave birth to a child who was taken from me and left to die," she wrote. "That child was saved by Sam Donovan and Martha Collins, who gave him life, love, and a real home. As someone who lost a child to family pride and social expectations, I can say with absolute certainty, Daniel belongs with the people who chose love over reputation, who chose him over convenience, who chose to be parents when it was hard instead of when it was easy." On the morning of the custody hearing, Daniel woke early and found Martha sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her coffee cup with red-rimmed eyes. "Mama," he said, climbing into her lap like he had when he was smaller, "are you scared?" Martha held him close, breathing in the little boy's scent of his hair. "A little, sweetheart." "Are you?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, then looked up at her with those serious brown eyes. "I'm not scared of what might happen," he said finally, "because no matter what any judge says, you'll always be my real mama, and Papa Sam will always be my real papa. Nobody can change that with papers or money or anything else." His simple faith gave Martha the strength she needed. "That's right, my brave boy. We're a family because we choose to be, and that choice lives in our hearts." The courthouse was packed beyond capacity for the hearing. People stood in the aisles and spilled out onto the street. Judge Morrison had to call for order repeatedly, as emotions ran high. Mrs. Sterling's legal team was impressive. 3 lawyers from Denver with experience in high-profile custody cases. They presented their arguments with professional polish, emphasizing the educational opportunities, financial security, and social advantages Daniel would gain in the Sterling household. Their witnesses included educators who testified about the limitations of small-town schooling, financial advisors who detailed the trust fund Mrs. Sterling had established for Daniel, and social workers who spoke about the broader opportunities wealthy families could provide. But their case began to crumble during cross-examination when John Webster asked pointed questions about Mrs. Sterling's actual experience with children, her travel schedule, which would keep her away from home for months at a time, and her plans for Daniel's relationship with his current family. Mrs. Sterling's own testimony was polished but cold. She spoke about Daniel as if he were a promising investment rather than a beloved child, emphasizing what she could give him materially, while barely mentioning love, security, or emotional bonds. The Donovan team's presentation was simpler, but infinitely more powerful. Sam testified about finding Daniel in the creek, and the love that had grown between them over the years. Martha spoke about watching Daniel grow from a frightened infant into a confident, caring boy. Dr. Morgan provided medical testimony about the importance of stable attachments in child development. Victoria and Johnny testified about their decision to support Daniel's adoption, emphasizing that they believed he belonged with the people who had saved and raised him. But the most compelling witness was Daniel himself. At 8 years old, he was legally too young to choose his custody arrangement, but Judge Morrison allowed him to speak informally about his wishes. Daniel approached the witness stand with the quiet dignity Sam and Martha had instilled in him. He looked out at the packed courtroom, saw Mrs. Sterling's expectant face, then turned to Judge Morrison. "Your Honor," he said in his clear young voice, "I know that lady wants to give me fancy things and send me to important schools. And I think she means well, but I already have everything I need." He pointed to Sam and Martha. "I have parents who love me so much. They fought to save my life when I was dying. I have a mama who reads to me every night and helps me with my lessons and makes me feel safe when I'm scared. I have a papa who teaches me to be honest and work hard and treat everyone with respect." Daniel's voice grew stronger. "I have friends who know my whole story and love me anyway. I have teachers who believe in me. I have a home where I belong completely." He looked directly at Mrs. Sterling then, his young face serious but kind. "Ma'am, you seem like a nice lady, and I'm grateful that you want to help me. But I don't need to be rescued. I need to stay with my family, my real family, the one that chose me and that I choose back." The courtroom was absolutely silent as Daniel returned to his seat between Sam and Martha. Mrs. Sterling's face was pale, and for the first time since arriving in Copper Ridge, she looked uncertain. Judge Morrison called for a brief recess, and when he returned, his decision was swift and final. "This court has heard compelling arguments from both sides," he began. "Mrs. Sterling can indeed provide material advantages that the Donovan family cannot match, but this court must consider what is in the best interests of the child, not what might appear best to outside observers." He looked at Daniel, who was holding both Sam and Martha's hands. "I have observed a child who is clearly thriving, emotionally, physically, and intellectually, in his current environment. I have heard testimony about unbreakable bonds formed through love, sacrifice, and mutual choice. I have seen evidence of a family that functions not because of obligation or expectation, but because of genuine care and commitment." The judge's voice grew firm. "Daniel Donovan will remain with his adoptive parents, Samuel and Martha Donovan. This court sees no compelling reason to disrupt a placement that has clearly served the child's best interests in every measurable way." The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Daniel threw his arms around both his parents, and for the first time in months, Martha allowed herself to cry tears of joy instead of fear. Mrs. Sterling sat quietly for a moment, then rose with dignity and approached the Donovan family. "Mr. and Mrs. Donovan," she said formally, "I can see why Daniel loves you so deeply. You've raised a remarkable young man." She knelt to Daniel's level one last time. "I hope you'll remember that you have family in Colorado who care about you, even if we can't be part of your daily life. Daniel, with the generous heart his parents had nurtured, hugged Mrs. Sterling gently. "Thank you for wanting to help me," he said simply. "Maybe you could visit sometimes? As family, not as someone who wants to change anything, but just as someone who cares." Mrs. Sterling's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion she'd shown since arriving in town. "I'd like that very much, Daniel." Epilogue. Full circle. 10 years later, Daniel Donovan graduated as valedictorian of the newly established Copper Ridge High School. At 18, he was everything his young self had promised to become: intelligent, compassionate, strong, and unshakably grounded in the love of his family. He'd grown tall like Johnny, inherited Sam's quiet strength and Martha's quick mind. But more than any physical traits, he'd developed the character that came from being raised by people who loved him completely and unconditionally. His graduation speech brought tears to every eye in the audience. 10 years ago, I stood in a courtroom and told a judge that I already had everything I needed. Today, I can say with even more certainty that love is the only inheritance that truly matters. Some of us are born into families, others are chosen by them, but the luckiest of us get to choose back. After graduation, Daniel surprised everyone by announcing his intention to study law. "I want to help families stay together," he explained. "I want to make sure other children get the same chance I got. To be loved for who they are, not who someone thinks they should become." Sam and Martha, now in their 60s but still vigorous, beamed with pride as their son prepared to leave for the territorial university. They'd saved every penny to give him this opportunity, and Daniel had earned scholarships to cover what they couldn't afford. Victoria and Johnny, now prosperous ranchers with 3 children of their own, attended the graduation with obvious pride. Their children called Daniel Cousin Daniel, and adored their older relative, who always had time for their questions and games. Dr. Morgan, still practicing in Copper Ridge, had watched Daniel grow from patient to student to friend. She often said that saving his life had been the most important work she'd ever done, not because of any medical skill she'd shown, but because of the love story she'd been privileged to witness. Sheriff Hayes, now retired, had taught Daniel everything he knew about reading people and situations. "That boy's got the makings of a fine judge someday," he'd tell anyone who'd listen. "He understands justice isn't about punishment, it's about making things right." Even Margaret Sterling had become an unexpected part of Daniel's extended family. She visited twice a year, bringing books and stories from her travels. She'd established a scholarship fund for children from small western towns who wanted to pursue higher education, her way of honoring what the Donovans had taught her about the value of love over money. On the night before Daniel left for university, the family gathered on the porch of their ranch house. The same house where a frightened 8-year-old had once asked if his mama would forget him if he had to go away. "Nervous?" Sam asked his son. Daniel smiled, looking out at the sunset over the mountains, where his life had begun in such dramatic fashion. "Excited," he corrected. "I'm going out into the world, but I'm taking everything you and Mama taught me. I'll never really be away from home." Martha wiped away a tear, remembering the dying infant Sam had carried into doctor. Morgan's clinic 18 years ago. "You know," she said softly, "when Papa first found you in that creek, I thought we were saving you. But really, you saved us. You brought us together and made us a family." Daniel stood and hugged both his parents, the people who had chosen him, fought for him, and loved him into the man he'd become. "We saved each other," he said simply. That's what families do. As the stars came out over Copper Ridge, the 3 of them sat in comfortable silence, secure in the knowledge that love, real, chosen, committed love, was indeed stronger than any force that might try to tear it apart. And somewhere in the distance, Willow Creek babbled its eternal song, carrying water from the mountains to the valley, just as it had carried a basket with a dying baby to the man who would become his father, setting in motion a story of rescue, love, and the unbreakable bonds that make a family. The end.